Hello, Rabbi. I can talk.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Aaron. Okay, welcome. Good to see you, Aaron. Let me just get the screen share on, and we're ready to start. It looks like this app updated and things have moved around. I'm trying to find the right spot here. Okay. Okay, here we go. So the laws of Shechita, chapter 9. We do continue with some gruesome aspects of injury to animal that would cause the animal to be considered treif. I think it was chapter 5 where we noted 8 or so types of injuries that would deem an animal to be treif. And today we will go through the next few. So Rambam begins with the first halacha. What is meant by the term pesuka, which means severed? And he goes on to explain. He says, if the skin that covers the marrow of the spinal cord is severed, then the animal is treif. He says this applies provided the majority of the circumference of the skin is severed. Excuse me. If ever the skin is split lengthwise, which is perforated, the animal is still permitted. Similarly, if the backbone was broken, but the spinal cord was not split, or the marrow within the cord was crushed and it would wobble, the animal is permitted because its skin is still intact. Okay, I can't tell you 100% sure what it means that the marrow is crushed and wobbles, but it would not fall under this category of treifa, which is caused by pesuka, which is caused by the severing of the skin around the spinal cord. Now that we've mentioned the so-called marrow that is within the spinal cord, so he says in halacha 2, if the marrow decomposes and it can be poured like water or like molten wax to the extent that the spinal cord cannot stand when it is lifted up, the animal is treif. If the reason it cannot stand is because of its weight, then the status is doubtful. By the way, this translation I noted somewhere where it says marrow might not be exactly precise, but it's some substance that's within the spinal cord. Halacha 3. To where does the spinal cord extend? Okay, so now we're saying that this certain injury around the spinal cord is going to deem the animal to be treif. So exactly what are we referring to? So he says it begins behind the 2 glands at the back of the neck and extends until the second divider. We'll explain that in a moment in the next halacha. Thus, nothing remains after it except the third divider, which is close to the beginning of the tail, and anything beyond that is not our concern as far as the spinal cord. And here in halacha 4, he tells us there are 3 dividers. There are 3 bones that cleave to each other below the vertebrae at the backbone. So so above, when we said the second of the 3, that's the extent of the spinal cord for our consideration here. What about the spinal cord of a fowl, a bird, extends to in between the wings. This, it seems, would be understood as where the bottom of where the wings lay against the bird. Below these places, we are not concerned with the cord that extends there, even if its skin was severed or its marrow decays. Obviously, because that's not as critical to the health of the animal as the spinal cord itself. Halacha 5. What is meant by the term karua? So now we're on to the next one. I think this was the 6th that the Rambam mentioned as an injury or an aspect that would deem an animal to be treif. So I'm getting a bit of feedback. I'm just going to mute everyone if it's okay. Mute all. If necessary, you can unmute yourself. when needed. Okay, so let's go back. So he says, what is meant by the term karua? So he says, this concerns the flesh which covers the majority of the animal's belly. Okay. Actually, when I was preparing this, I was eating, and it was not good for the experience. So here we're talking about the skin that covers the belly of the animal. If it's ripped open, the belly will fall out. If this flesh is ripped open, the animal is treif. So he says this applies even if the tear did not reach the belly itself to the extent that it is seen. Instead, since the majority of the thickness of this flesh was ripped open and removed, the animal is treif. So here we're talking about the depth of the cut. Now we're going to talk about the length, I guess, of the cut. What is the measure of the tear? It must be a handbreadth long. If the animal is small and the majority of the length of the flesh covering the belly was torn, it's treif, even though the tear is not a handbreadth long. So if a tefach is a handbreadth, if the belly of the animal is 2 handbreadths or is less than 2 handbreadths, so then even if it's not if the majority is torn, it's less than a handbreadth. So the majority is torn, even though the actual tear is not a handbreadth, it would still be treif. Halacha 6. The following law applies if a circular or oblong portion of the flesh was cut. This is where the cut was not as deep or as long as what was prescribed in Halacha 5, but there's a piece of flesh that's now missing from that area of the belly. So he says if it was larger than a cellar. So a cellar is, the diameter of a cellar is 1/3 of a tefach, meaning that it's large enough to fit tightly 3 date seeds next to each other, then the animal is treif. And this is the critical point. For when the size cut will be extended, in other words, if you unwind that circle, it will be a handbreadth in length. So if that amount is missing, it's a weakness essentially that we're concerned will eventually cause the stomachs to fall out, making the animal treif. Halacha 7. When the skin of an animal was removed from it entirely. So this is a second component of this category that we call karua. It either means that there's actually a cut in the belly, as we've described it, or here's another definition of karua, which means if the hide of the animal was skinned from it entirely. And he says whether this was done by hand or if it decomposed due to sickness, the animal is treif. This is what the halacha calls a goluda. Now, if a portion of the skin as wide as a cellar remained on the entire backbone, one as wide as a cellar remained on the navel, and one as wide as a cellar remained on the tips of the limbs, the animal is permitted. The Rambam here is referring to 3 parts of the animal: the backbone, the navel, and the tips of the limbs. The Gemara discusses that if a significant amount of hide remains there, then it will regenerate. La halacha, the Rambam requires that you have an amount of hide on each of these points, and then it would be kosher. But if you don't have hide on each of those points, he says here as wide as a cellar, and the hide has been removed, so it's just flesh that is exposed, the animal is treif. If a portion as wide as a cellar was removed from the entire backbone, from the navel, or from the tips of the limbs, but the remainder of the skin remained intact, there is a doubt concerning the ruling. It appears to me that we permit the animal. See, this is the opposite, that the entire hide is still there, but from one of these spots, an amount of hide is missing and the flesh is exposed. The Rambam says that it's doubtful, but he would appear to him that it should be permitted because, after all, the majority of the hide still remains, the vast majority of the hide still remains on the animal, including those, at least 2 of the other, so to speak, critical spots on the animal. Halacha 8. What is meant by the term nefula? Nefula means an animal that has fallen over. So he explains it. When an animal fell from a high place, and what's considered high, at least 10 handbreadths high. So that's what we'd call that's less than a meter, really, less than a meter. Yet if it falls and one of its organs is crushed, it is treif. To what extent must it be crushed? It must be smashed and become alien because of the fall, to the extent that its form and appearance have been destroyed. In other words, of that internal organ. Even though the organ is not perforated, cracked, or broken, the animal is treif. Similarly, if one struck it with a stone or a staff and crushed one of its organs, it is treif. So the nefula either means it fell and had some type of internal injury, or was hit in a way that causes an internal injury. then it is treif. To which organs are we referring? To those in the body's inner cavity. So all the upper organs of the body. Halacha 9, if an animal walks after falling from roof, so now it fell. It's fallen more than 10 tefachim. But it gets up and walks immediately, then we don't have to suspect that it's treif. If it stood, it managed to stand itself up, but it can't walk, so then we're suspicious. And we'll see how this informs what we might do with this animal. So in other words, you have to be suspicious. Maybe one of the internal organs has been crushed, and therefore it's treif, maybe not. If it jumped from the roof on its own initiative, we do not harbor suspicions. So this idea that if an animal falls, it becomes treif because you're concerned that an internal organ has been smashed is dafka when it fell, not if it jumped. And the reason over here is that because if it jumps, we assume that the animal makes its own calculation to do it in a way that it's not going to injure itself. So it will create its own type of resistance to the impact. If a person left his animal on a roof and found it on the ground, we do not suspect that it fell. It's unusual for it to fall, and we can assume that it jumped. Halacha 10, when bulls butt each other, we do not harbor suspicions. Again, remember it said if you hit the animal, it can render it treif because we're concerned, and we'll see exactly how examples of how one might hit an animal that maybe internal damage was done. But when animals fight each other, again, there seems to be some natural level of protection that they provide for themselves. So we don't have to worry just because you saw them goring and butting each other that maybe they sustain some type of internal injury. Now, but if these two animals are butting and one of them falls to the ground, then this becomes a bit of a situation of doubt. Similarly, if we see an animal dragging its feet, we do not suspect that its organs were crushed or that its backbone was severed. You don't have to just automatically assume. You can safely assume that maybe there's a slight injury in the foot. The fact that it's not walking as it should doesn't necessarily mean that there's some type of fatal injury. Halacha 11, when thieves steal lambs and throw them outside the corral, is that how you pronounce it? Corral, the pen, right? So, right, unfortunately, there were Yiddish thieves also. So he came into his friend's farm, goes into the pen, takes a sheep and chucks it over so he can then go and take it home with him, take it to the market to sell. So he says like this, but essentially what's happened is it's now been thrown. So it's fallen from a height of higher than 10 tefachim. He says, nonetheless, we don't suspect that it's treif. Why? Because they throw them only with the intent that they will not be broken. We assume that the guy's good at his job, that he's going to throw this animal in a way that is considerate to the animal, that the animal doesn't get internally injured, because obviously then it diminishes the animal's value for what this person is stealing it for. Now, what is it like this? He throws it over, he's stealing it. Then he returns it. So here the Rambam says there's two reasons why a guy might return it. Maybe he chucked the sheep over and he's running to get it and he sees the police coming. So now he's afraid. So what does he do? He takes it and he chucks it back into the pen. So he says, in that case, and as if he chucks it back because of fear, then we suspect that they may have become treif because he's not considerate to the animal. He's just concerned for himself. So he'll chuck it without any real consideration and run. But if you return them out of a desire to repent, in other words, maybe he took the animal away. Nobody saw him. He had nothing to be afraid of. He got away with it. But then he has the remorse and he wants to do teshuvah and he comes back, sheepishly to return his sheep. Then we can assume that he did it with the same consideration as when he first threw it out. Because if his intention is teshuvah, his intention is not to return something in a worse condition than he took it, right? So if we return them out of desire to repent, we do not harbor suspicions about the lambs because the thieves have the intent of returning them intact, and therefore they will be careful when throwing them back. Because that's teshuvah, returning it in a way that you took it. He doesn't want to be liable for any damage. Halacha 12, when an ox is forced to lie down for slaughter. So now it's being manhandled, basically. We do not suspect that its internal organs were crushed. This applies even if it fell considerably to the extent that it made a great noise. It thuds to the ground. Why? The rationale is that it implants its hooves into it and it strengthens itself until it falls to the ground. Because it's being, I guess, the way I understand it is, it's manhandled, so it's going to kind of protect itself. So flailing around actually would soften its fall, and we're not concerned that something internally may have been crushed. Halacha 13. If one struck an animal on its head and the blow extends towards its tail, or one hit it on its tail and the blow extends towards its head. So the way I understand it is either a long stick or a whip or something, right? So it hits flat basically on the length of the animal. Even if one struck it on the entire backbone, we do not suspect that it became treifa. What we'll see is because the impact is extended, it's obviously not targeting a specific area where it might damage a particular organ. If I have this staff that he's hitting with has bulges in different points, then we do have a doubt that maybe it damaged an internal organ. Now, if the head of the staff reaches a portion of the backbone, then we harbor suspicion. Similarly, we harbor suspicions if we struck the animal across the breadth of the backbone rather than along the length of it. Because then there's a more direct impact on a particular part of the animal, and that may have caused internal damage that we need to be concerned for. Halacha 14. When a fowl is knocked against a firm article, so a bird hits something solid, for example, a heap of grain, a mound of almonds, or the like, we suspect that its internal organs may have been crushed. So this would be the similar to an animal falling. If by contrast, when I'm learning these halachot, I'm imagining, I'm sure everybody's had that experience. You're sitting in the room and all of a sudden you hear a thump on the window behind you, right? A bird smacks itself into the window. So birds sometimes fly into things, or maybe someone threw it into something. So if it is knocked against something solid, then we are concerned for an internal damage to its organs. If by contrast is knocked against something soft, for example, a folded garment, or straw, or ashes or the like, then there's no need for suspicion. Halacha 15. The following law applies when a bird's wings become stuck with glue. This seems to be part of the method of how they may have trapped birds to somehow get their wings stuck down. So what happens if it's both wings are now stuck down and it gets a club? Meaning we understand that the wings would otherwise give it some protection. It would put its wings out to soften any clap or blow or fall. But if its wings are stuck, so now what's the halacha? So he says, if only one wing became stuck, we do not suspect it became treifa, because we expect them that even with the one wing, somehow it would soften the blow, it would protect itself. But if both of the wings became stuck and it received a blow on its body, then we do have a suspicion that maybe there's internal injury, and we've got to be concerned for that. Following the rule applies if it knocked against water. So it's flying, it either flew into water, it fell against water. Now you're watching it. If it swims for its full height upriver against the current, then we have no need to suspect that it became treif. It's like an animal that would get up and walk. If it swims downstream with the current, then there is a suspicion. Maybe it's the water that is causing it to float down. However, if it advances towards straw or hay that is floating on the river, which likewise would be being pulled by the current, and it actually outswims the hay, so then we can say that it's swimming with its own power and there's no need to suspect that there's some type of internal injury. Halacha 17. In all situations, we said we do not harbor. Okay, so now we've spoken about situations where you've got to be concerned that maybe there's an internal injury, and sometimes where we're not concerned of internal injury. So what happens when we, in a scenario where there is concern for internal injury? We have a suspicion. So you got this animal that fell and it's standing, but it hasn't walked. What do? So he says it's permitted to slaughter the animal immediately, and it's not necessary to check whether an organ, in the case where it stood up and walked, so there's no suspicion, you can shecht it and you don't have to do any extraordinary internal checks. In all situations where we said we harbor suspicion, so for example, the animal that stood up and didn't walk forward, so if you shechted it immediately, then what you have to do is you have to do an entire internal check of all those inner organs of that area of the animal. If any of the factors that render an animal treif mentioned above were discovered, or one of the inner organs was crushed to the extent that its form was destroyed, the animal is treif, even if one of the organs whose removal does not render the animal treif. Now, as we spoke about different animal organs that may have been removed, that wouldn't make a treif. In this case, if that particular organ was crushed, it will be treif. So for example, the spleen or the kidneys, if they are crushed, the animal is treif. What's an exception to an internal organ crushed that would not render it treif is the uterus. Otherwise, as soon as it's crushed, even though had that particular organ been removed, it would not make a treif. A crushed organ is considered more fatal than an organ that is removed. Halacha 18, the gullet and the windpipe do not require examination in these situations, for a fall will not crush them. In other words, although we know those are critical parts of the anatomy of the animal when it comes to considering the health of the animal, as a result of a fall, we have no suspicions around it. Halacha 19, when an animal fell from a roof and did not stand afterwards. So this is where it fell and it's lying on the ground. It didn't even stand. So it's forbidden to slaughter it until one waits an entire day. You have to wait 24 hours. If one slaughtered it during this time, it's considered treif. When one slaughters it after 24 hours, then you have to do that full examination as we explained earlier, because there's a suspicion that there may be internal fatal injury. Halacha 20, similarly, if a person treaded on a fowl, so you're walking, you stood on a bird with his feet, or an animal walked on it. Now, this is not where it actually broke skin, like other examples we spoke about earlier in the halachot, or it was crushed against a wall, and it is in death throes. We leave it alive for a day. So it falls and it's moving around, but it's not flying as it should. Leave it for a day. Afterwards, then you can shecht it and do an internal examination, because obviously, as we've seen, there's reason to be concerned that maybe there's internal injury. And the final halacha in this chapter, when the majority of the windpipe and the gullet was separated and hanging loosely, the animal is treif. I'm not quite sure how this works, but that's the scenario. This applies even if this condition occurs due to reasons other than a fall. Similarly, if they became folded over, the animal is unacceptable. And here the reason is because they are no longer fit for ritual slaughter. Because in order to shecht it, they have to be taught so that it can be cut cleanly and precisely and at the right spot. If by contrast, even though the majority of the throat was set loose, if by contrast, the majority of the throat was set loose from the jawbone, the animal is permitted, for the throat area is not fit for ritual slaughter, as we explained. In other words, if it's higher up than the area where you would be shechting, then we're not concerned if it's loose at that point, because as we said over here, it's not about the indication that itself is a fatal injury, but it's more about how it incapacitates us from being able to shecht as would be required. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's lesson. Wonderful to see everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And
Rabbi, a quick question.
Sure.
If you look at number 13, it talks about the animal being hit on its head. I was trying to relate that to the concept of stunning an animal, which has been a controversy for a while. Do you see that as being the same thing?
I would imagine so. When you say controversy, from what I understand from halacha, there's no controversy. It's simply we don't do it.
It's
yes.
a controversy,
and it's probably
correct.
And so yes. But some have, those who promote it suggest that maybe we should do it. And I think correctly that here we would see a reason why we absolutely wouldn't do it, because it would make that all treif even before you begin to shecht it.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Okay, shekach everyone. Have a beautiful day further, and a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavuot. We wish each other before Shavuot that you should receive the Torah with joy and internally, and we'll be back. We'll see you next week.
Chag Sameach.
Bye-bye.